Our story begins with a man whose first act upon being reborn was to hollow out the floorboards of his room, digging downward like a frantic marmot. He carved out a hole 3 meters deep, all because in his past life, he had been far too flashy. That mistake led to a demonic cultivator breaking in at night, turning him into a human elixir and leaving him with nothing but a gruesome end. This time, he would rather play the fool forever than stand out even slightly. And so, he didn't just coat the pit in deadly poison. He buried triggered stone spikes at the bottom. To be honest, it was a bit much, but safety comes first. If any short-sighted demonic cultivator dared to step foot into his room, they would be silently eliminated and turned into excellent fertilizer for the flowers. We see him now, gritting his teeth as he swings his pickaxe with all his might, slamming it against the hard rock. The recoil vibrates through the wooden handle, numbing his hands until they nearly split open. Sweat mixed with limestone dust flows into his eyes, causing a stinging, piercing pain. Yet, he doesn't even dare to wipe them. He can only move like a heartless machine, mechanically swinging that pickaxe. Deep down, he knows the truth. He cannot stop. In this ghost of a place, stopping means the whip, starvation, or even losing his life altogether, which, naturally, is a powerful motivator. Even now, Yi Chenzhou's mind is still a bit of a blur. Only 3 days ago, he was just an office worker pulling overtime late into the night. In the blink of an eye, he was transported to this cruel world of cultivation. He didn't become a peerless genius, and no mysterious mentor arrived to save him. Instead, he became a lowly mining laborer at the very bottom of the Tianxian sect. Here, he has no rights and no status whatsoever. In the eyes of the cultivators, these workers are worth less than the sect's dogs. They are merely consumables. Their daily task is to dig day and night. If they fail to meet the mining quota, they are beaten or denied food. In the worst cases, they are thrown to the beasts on the back mountain. Suddenly, an explosion echoes nearby, drawing everyone's terrified attention. The overseer, Zhao Taizhan, may only be at the 3rd level of qi refining, but to these mortal laborers, he is as terrifying as the king of hell himself. Nearby, a frail laborer finally hits his limit and leans against the rock wall to catch his breath. Unfortunately, he catches Tieshan's eye instead. Without a single word, Taizhan lashes out with his whip. The laborer's thin hemp clothes shatter instantly, leaving a deep, bloody gash across his back. The man collapses, trembling uncontrollably. Ignoring the searing pain, the frail laborer crawls frantically to grab his pickaxe once more. Gasping for air, he cries out for mercy, promising to dig immediately and never dare to be lazy again. It was a miserable sight, to say the least. The surrounding laborers held their breath in terror, and those who had considered begging for mercy quickly swallowed their words, instead redoubling their efforts. They buried their heads in their work, desperate to survive. Yi Chenzhou caught a glimpse out of the corner of his eye, his heart racing as he immediately looked away. He kept his expression blank and his breathing steady, acting like a heartless mining machine. In this mad world of cultivation, having no strength, while trying to be a hero, is pure suicide. His rule for survival was simple: keep your head down, work hard, and never cause trouble. Zhao Taizhan walked past Yi Chenzhou, whip in hand, glancing at the crushed ore at his feet and his steady, composed movements. The overseer let out a satisfied grunt before swaggering off toward the next mining area. Only when the footsteps finally faded did Yi Chenzhou finally allow his tense back to relax. Taking advantage of a brief moment to catch his breath, he whispered a silent command in his mind. A semi-transparent light blue screen, visible only to him, instantly popped up. This was his only trump card in this new world: the attribute extraction panel. To be honest, the interface was incredibly simple, lacking any flashy features or complex menus. Its sole purpose was to allow him to extract attributes from others and perfectly integrate them into his own body. When he first discovered this golden finger, Yi Chenzhou was so excited he nearly cried out in joy. He had been tempted to grab a piece of spirit stone immediately to extract its power and soar to greatness on the spot. But he forced himself to hold back. From the original owner's memories, he knew the Tianxian sect's control over spirit stones was incredibly strict. Every stone was inspected 3 times. If he touched a stone and it turned into useless rock, Zhao Taizhan would undoubtedly kill him on the spot. The tall blade of grass is the first to be cut, and only the cautious survive. For 3 days, he resisted temptation and acted as a simple laborer, all to find an absolutely safe target for extraction. Suddenly, the gongs signaling the end of the shift echoed through the mine. The laborers dropped their tools as if a great weight had been lifted, collapsing to the ground. Soon, they formed a long line, carrying heavy baskets to the screening area to hand in their work. Yi Chenzhou blended into the crowd, his quota of or sitting exactly on the passing line. He was neither the best nor the worst, perfectly invisible. While the others rushed like madmen toward the kitchen for food, Yi Chenzhou stood perfectly still. His gaze was locked onto the massive waste pit in the corner of the screening area, where a mountain of discarded materials lay piled high. The discarded iron or screened out was hard and devoid of spiritual energy, so useless that even mortal blacksmiths would reject it. To the sect, it was pure, unadulterated trash. Every night, someone would haul it away to the waste fortress, and naturally, no one cared about the fate of a pile of rubbish. Yi Chenzhou took a deep breath, grabbed a large broom, and walked quickly toward the 2-meter-high mountain of scrap iron, pretending to clean the area. With no one around and the registration steward already inside drinking tea, he dropped the broom and pressed his right hand firmly against a head-sized piece of rough, black iron. In his mind, he gave a low command for the panel to activate the extraction process. To be honest, this was the moment he had been waiting for. The pale blue light screen popped up instantly. Discarded iron or detected. Extractable attribute, hardness. Yichinjo did not hesitate for a second and confirmed the extraction. A powerful suction force suddenly surged from his palm, and that solid piece of iron ore instantly lost its luster, crumbling in his hand and turning into a pile of gray-white powder that flowed onto the ground. The panel notified him of the success, hardness +1. His blood raced with excitement as he thrust both hands directly into the massive pile of iron scrap. The panel's notifications began to flash frantically as the ore before him visibly turned to ash. In less than the time it takes to burn half an incense stick, a large section of the pile had been sucked dry into powder, and his hardness attribute soared straight to 100 points. He quickly stopped. If he continued, the waste pile would collapse, and there would be no way to explain that. He used his feet to mix the powder with mud, thoroughly destroying all traces of his work. Deep down, he felt a surge of anticipation as he whispered the command to fuse the 100 points of hardness into his entire body's skin. An icy, bone-chilling sensation erupted from his heart, following his blood to every corner of his frame. It felt as if countless ice needles were piercing his skin, not painful, exactly, but tightened to the absolute limit. It was as if high-density, metallic liquid was being forcibly mixed with his muscle fibers. After a dozen breaths, the strange sensation finally faded. Shinjo squeezed his forearm and realized the texture had completely changed. What was once ordinary flesh now felt as tough as century-old ox hide. Even when he pinched down with all his might, he couldn't leave a single white mark. He picked up a sharp stone fragment and aimed it at the back of his hand, giving it a hard scrape. The sharp stone slid across his skin as if it were a steel plate, leaving only a very faint white line that vanished with a light rub of his thumb. Yichinjo couldn't help but gasp. Even the lowest dregs of the waste pile were powerful. Stacking 100 points of low-level attributes had made him invulnerable. If he added more, Zhao Tieshan's whip would likely snap upon impact. He suppressed his inner excitement, cleaned the area, and brushed the dust off his clothes. To be honest, he felt like a new man. He walked quickly toward the kitchen. With this hardness attribute as his foundation, he finally felt a flicker of safety in this dangerous cultivation world. The next morning, the 4-eared bronze gong rang out once again, driving all the laborers back down into the dark depths of the mine shafts. The environment in Mining Area 4 was even worse. Water seeped from the walls, and the ground was a mess of mud. Yichinjo raised his heavy pickaxe. He slammed the tool into the rock before him. The moment the impact echoed, his eyes lit up. Yesterday, the recoil had made his bones ache. But today, the vibration reaching his hands was completely absorbed, as if by invisible iron armor. He felt no pain whatsoever, which, naturally, was a relief. Instead, the tension in his arms seemed to increase his strength. His pickaxe became a blur, and his mining efficiency instantly doubled. He planned to finish early to save his energy for more attribute extractions tonight. But as he focused on the stubborn rock, something changed. A faint cracking sound came from above. An old laborer nearby screamed in terror, his voice cracking as he warned the young man to run. Yichinjo looked up sharply. At the top of the shaft, a massive rock weighing hundreds of pounds had completely broken loose from the ceiling. It whistled through the air, falling straight toward his head. The space was too cramped and the mud too thick. There was simply no room to dodge. In that split second, Yichinjo instinctively raised his iron pickaxe in front of him to block the blow. It was a desperate move, really. The heavy rock slammed into the thick iron tool with terrifying force. The impact was so violent that the solid metal handle began to buckle. The pickaxe was snapped and bent by the sheer weight. The sharp, heavy head of the tool spun out of control, rebounding through the air. With explosive momentum, the broken metal piece flew back directly toward the back of Yichinjo's hand. It was moving far too fast to avoid. The surrounding laborers squeezed their eyes shut, expecting a bloody spray. But a second later, the expected tragedy failed to materialize. The metal struck his hand, yet there was no blood. Instead, a crisp metallic ring echoed through the dust-filled cave. Imagine the confusion of the onlookers. The old laborer nearby fell back into the mud, staring in total disbelief. Using the rising dust as cover, Yichinjo quickly hid his hand. He pulled his arm into his sleeve and shook his wrist. Not only was there no serious injury, but he hadn't even broken the skin. To him, that impact felt like nothing more than a light tap from a wooden stick. Deep down, he was marveling at the sheer power of his new attributes. On the surface, however, he immediately put on a terrified expression. He scrambled backward on all fours, intentionally leaving his broken pickaxe behind. The old laborer nearby stammered in shock, telling him his luck was far too great. Had that blow landed differently, his hand would have been crushed into pulp. Yichinjo gave a simple, honest-looking smile and claimed he was just lucky to have only scraped the skin. He reached down and grabbed a handful of dust. He smeared the grime over the back of his hand, pretending to dress a wound. And just like that, he easily fooled everyone. A few days passed by in a flash. Soon, the day of the end-of-month assessment arrived for the laborers. In the center of the main courtyard, a dozen large black wooden crates were lined up. The overseer, Zhao Taizhan, sat in a grand chair fiddling with 2 jade stones. Beside him stood several fierce-looking disciples of the law enforcement squad. The manager shouted the name Qian Youfu, followed by his results: 80 pounds of low-grade spirit ore, which, as it turned out, exceeded the quota. His reward was half a gathering yuan pill. The crowd immediately erupted in envious gasps. Qian Youfu, his face glowing with pride, hurried forward. He took the half pill and stepped away. Yi Chenzhou watched the scene clearly. As soon as Qian Youfu stepped off the platform, the atmosphere shifted. The eyes of several old laborers turned into those of hungry wolves, staring fixedly at the pill in the man's pocket. Yi Chenzhou understood the situation perfectly. In a cutthroat place like this, showing off your wealth is essentially a death wish. Soon enough, the manager called out Yi Chenzhou's name. He carried his mining basket with his head bowed, walked to the crates, and poured all the ore inside with a loud clatter. The disciple in charge of weighing glanced at the scale. With a blank expression, the disciple announced 50 pounds of low-grade ore. He had barely passed, earning only the minimum ration of 1 pound of low-grade spirit rice. Zhao Taizhan didn't even bother to look up. To him, a useless laborer who barely hits the passing mark, neither standing out nor making mistakes, wasn't worth a single insult. Yi Chenzhou respectfully accepted the small bag of withered spirit rice. He hunched his shoulders and retreated to the most inconspicuous corner of the crowd. A few laborers who had been sizing him up saw his pathetic reward and immediately looked away in disdain. Yi Chenzhou let out a cold laugh in his heart. This was exactly the result he wanted: total invisibility. Over the past few days, it wasn't that he couldn't find more ore. He had chosen his path carefully. He had intentionally crushed the extra ore and tossed it into the waste pit. After all, what use is half a low-quality pill if you aren't alive to use it? As the night grew deep and the world fell silent, we see him return to his private routine once again. Inside the cramped and bitter dormitory, the snoring sounds like rolling thunder. Suddenly, Yi Chenzhou snaps his eyes open and, like a black cat, moves with silent grace. He slips off the bed and glides along the base of the wall, leaving the courtyard without a sound. This time, he avoids his usual spot at the scrap or pit. Instead, he heads toward a place smelling of pungent, burnt waste, the dross from the alchemy room, filled with violent fire toxins and impurities. If anyone dared to practice with this waste, their meridians would shatter by morning. But for Yi Chenzhou, this is something else entirely. To him, this is an unguarded mountain of gold. He squats before the pile of alchemical dross, rubs his hands together, and thrusts them directly into the warm, charred remains. In his mind, he commands the interface to begin extraction. A pale blue light screen instantly flickers to life before his eyes. The system detects the dross, identifying extractable attributes, fire toxins, and trace amounts of spiritual energy. Yi Chenzhou's eyes light up immediately. His golden finger can indeed strip away the impurities automatically. Without hesitation, he orders it to extract only the trace spiritual energy. The system notifications flash rapidly as the dross loses its final glimmer, turning into a pile of odorless, gray ash. It was quite a sight, really. Clusters of pure spiritual energy, completely free of toxins, surged through his arms and into his limbs. It felt like a parched traveler finding an oasis. His withered meridians expand rapidly under the wash of pure energy, becoming resilient and strong. Deep down, he could feel his very foundation shifting. There was no need for complex techniques or focused guidance. The extracted energy was forced directly into his body, converting into base cultivation. His bones emit faint popping sounds. In his dantian, which was once an empty void, a fist-sized vortex of energy begins to coalesce and spin. The vortex spins faster and faster as it absorbs the remaining energy. And just like that, the process was complete. Yi Chenzhou's cultivation quietly breaks through to the second level of qi refining. However, he immediately uses the interface to lock down his external aura. The next morning, the first thing he does upon waking is check his status, ensuring his visible power remains firmly suppressed at the first level. To be safe, he even makes his aura look a bit unstable. He wanted to look like a malnourished weakling on the verge of collapse. He splashes some water on his face and pushes open the drafty wooden door. Outside, the common area of the labor quarters is already buzzing with excitement. A group of laborers who received their monthly rewards yesterday are gathered together. In any other place, this would be a normal morning. Qian Youfu stands in the center of the crowd and lets out a sudden shout as a small orange flame flickers to life in the palm of his hand. The flame is barely the size of a fist, but Qian Youfu proudly announces it as the flame bullet technique, which he just learned at the outer sect. The surrounding laborers immediately shower him with flattery, claiming that since he's mastered a spell, he's guaranteed a spot in the outer sect next month. But just as the words leave their mouths, the weak flame flickers twice and dies. Meanwhile, Yi Chenzhou passes by carrying a battered water bucket. He doesn't even give them a second glance. In his eyes, flashy things like the flame bullet technique are nothing more than a death sentence. Imagine meeting an enemy at midnight and spending ages chanting a mantra just to make your hand glow. To be honest, it's a terrible plan. Lighting up a bright fire in the dark is like sticking a sign on your forehead that says, "Come kill me." It's fighting with built-in lighting effects. It's as if he's afraid the enemy won't find him. In this world of cultivation, more people vanish every day than there are stray dogs in the valley. Yi Chinzhou has carved caution into his very bones. The less noticeable and more transparent he is, the longer he will likely survive. After setting down his bucket, we see him wander over to the most remote corner of the valley, the dilapidated old library pavilion. This place is usually deserted, with broken shelves and old books covered in a layer of dust so thick it's practically a blanket. The old man in charge of the gate is sprawled out in a rocking chair, snoring loud enough to shake the heavens. Yi Chinzhou tiptoes past him. He rummages through a pile of junk used to prop up table legs, and eventually pulls out a threadbare book that is nearly falling apart. He brushes off the heavy dust to reveal 4 crookedly written characters on the cover. Basic insights. It was a simple manual for mortal warriors. It doesn't even teach how to circulate spiritual energy. It only covers basic physical movements like how to swing a sword or how to strike. Even the lowliest laborers in the sect would despise this book, feeling that practicing such common trash would disgrace the name of cultivation. But this is exactly what Yi Chinzhou wants. No light, no flashy effects, and perfectly silent movements. It's the ultimate tool for staying hidden. He takes the tattered book to the entrance and taps lightly on the table. The old gatekeeper rubs his eyes and wakes up with a start. The old man looks at the book with pure disdain, asking why he's bothering with such trash that doesn't even qualify as a low-tier technique. He tells him that practicing this for a lifetime would only make him a mortal blacksmith at best. Yi Chinzhou just scratches his head and smiles. He plays the fool, saying he just wants to use the movements to stretch his stiff muscles after a long day of work. The old man just sighs. The old man dismissively waves him away, telling him to just take it before rolling over to resume his nap. Yi Chinzhou tucks the basic manual into his robe. He heads straight for the woodshed behind the mountain. Today's task is to chop 500 pounds of black ironwood, a wood so incredibly dense and stubborn. It feels like raw pig iron. For a normal laborer, a day of swinging an axe at this would leave their palms cracked and bleeding, but Yi Chinzhou remains calm. The hardness attribute he extracted on his first day has long since integrated into his skin. He picks out a battered axe with a chipped blade from the pile. Taking a deep breath, he mentally replays the first move of the basic insights, the simple vertical cleave. There are no flashy or unnecessary flourishes here. He bends his legs slightly, and with a sudden surge of power from his waist, the force flows through his shoulders and down into his arms. Finally, all that energy pours into the broken axe. With a crisp crack, the rusty blade strikes the grain of the black ironwood with surgical precision. The iron hardwood splits perfectly in two, leaving a clean, smooth surface. At that exact moment, his status panel flashes brightly before his eyes. The movement is recognized. His proficiency in basic insights increases by 1. Yi Chinzhou's eyes widen in realization. It seems his theory was correct. This cheat code doesn't actually require him to hold a real sword, as long as the mechanics, power delivery, and trajectory match the core of the technique. His daily chores can be converted into martial mastery. He immediately transforms into a workaholic warrior, tackling the woodpile with newfound intensity. He is no longer just mindlessly chopping wood. With every swing, he meticulously adjusts his breathing, his footwork, and the exact amount of force used. Each strike is calculated. Not a single ounce of energy is wasted, nor is any strike too weak. By the time the morning is over, he has finished 300 logs. Those hundreds of precise strikes cause his understanding of the cleave to skyrocket. Normally, swinging an axe that many times would leave a man's arms useless. However, Yi Chinzhou has his hardness attribute protecting him. Not only is he unharmed, but his muscles are actually adapting to this extreme efficiency. Before noon, Qian Youfu happens to pass by the woodshed. Seeing Yi Chinzhou drenched in sweat and working so hard, he can't help but let out a mocking laugh. He sneers that no matter how well one chops wood, it won't help them ascend to the heavens. He suggests Yi Chinzhou spend more time sensing spiritual energy instead. Yi Chinzhou stops to wipe his brow, replying with a humble, honest smile that his talent is poor, so he'd rather focus on finishing his chores. He claims he just doesn't want his pay docked during the month-end evaluation. Qian Youfu mutters that he's a hopeless case, rolls his eyes, and walks away. Yi Chinzhou couldn't care less. He turns back, grips his axe tightly, and continues his work as the proficiency points on his panel steadily climb. That afternoon, Yi Chinzhou arrives at the abandoned mine right on schedule. He lifts the heavy pickaxe, his gaze fixed intensely on the jagged rock face. In his mind, he instantly translates the rough or into the patterns of his basic insights. He grips the handle firmly with both hands, preparing his stance. His legs push off the ground like a drawn bow suddenly released. The tip of the pickaxe becomes a blur, a remnant shadow cutting through the air. It slams into the rock, sending fragments flying as his proficiency points climb once more. He follows up with a series of thrusts, sweeps, and slashes. We see Yi Chinzhou deconstructing every mining movement into a sword technique. In the dim light of the pit, he strikes again and again with frantic precision. While others rely on brute force, he relies on micro-adjustments. To stay under the radar, he deliberately slows down his actual or production. He ensures each strike hits worthless waste rock rather than valuable spirit stones. By the end of the day, his haul sits exactly on the passing line. The overseer gives him a look of pure disdain, waving him away like a bothersome fly. And so, the days begin to blur into one another. 1 month passes, then 2, then half a year. The faces in the labor camp change constantly, including that arrogant fellow, Qian Youfu. After a late-night brawl over a low-grade spirit stone, Qian Youfu is injured and tossed out like trash. Meanwhile, Yi Chinzhou remains a constant. He continues his routine of chopping wood and mining, or without fail. He has become almost invisible now, his presence dampened to an incredible degree. Sometimes, people walk right past him without even realizing a living person is standing there. He has suppressed his breathing and movements to the limit. But beneath that quiet exterior, the data on his panel is surging at a terrifying speed. His understanding of the sword has reached an unthinkable level. At this point, even if he were holding nothing but a simple chopstick, a casual flick would contain the perfect mechanics of a master. Every movement is perfectly aligned with the essence of the sword, precise, fast, and devastatingly accurate. It is a mastery born of repetition. When he finally executes a strike, it is so silent it makes one's skin crawl. It is as if the very air around him has been stilled by the blade. This seemingly ordinary strike slices through the air, and suddenly, his status panel erupts with a blinding red light. As he hits his 10,000th repetition of basic insights, a special attribute finally emerges: extreme sharpness. To be honest, it was only a matter of time. On the 5th day of the month, the day for rations, a long line forms outside the administrative office. For these laborers, this is the most important day. The 2 pounds of low-grade rations are their only hope for survival and a tiny bit of cultivation. Yi Chinzhou quietly blends into the crowd. We see him standing at the back of the line, hands tucked into his sleeves like a drowsy wooden statue. Meanwhile, the overseer, Zhao Taizhan, reclines in his chair, tossing snacks into the air. When a laborer named Zhou Dazhuang steps forward to collect his rations, he weighs the bag in his hand and immediately panics. It doesn't even contain a single pound of rice. He asks if the rules haven't changed, as it's supposed to be 2 pounds a month. Poor Dazhuang clutches his stomach, trembling on the ground in desperation. The rice in his hand spills across the dirt. Zhao Taizhan steps forward, grinding the scattered grains into the mud with his boot as he shouts that his word is the only rule here. He explains that because last month's production was below quota, the higher-ups docked his pay. Naturally, he has no intention of paying out of his own pocket when he can take it from these failures. He tells them to take the half-pound of rice or get out. To be honest, it wasn't much of a choice at all. The entire crowd of laborers is too terrified to even breathe loudly. Zhao Taizhan is now at the 4th level of qi refining. If he killed a laborer and tossed them in the mountains, no one would even ask. When it is his turn, Yi Chinzhou trots forward quickly, his face instantly smoothing into a practiced, flattering smile. Suddenly, Zhao Taizhan raises a hand to stop his subordinate from handing over the rice. He snorts, noting that he's heard Yi Chinzhou has been quite the slacker lately. He points out that Ye's production always hits the exact minimum requirement, and asks if he is intentionally hiding his true output. This, of course, was a blatant setup for a bribe. The surrounding laborers cast sympathetic glances his way. Yi Chinzhou simply chuckles along, telling the overseer that with a physique like his, hitting the minimum is already a life-and-death struggle. But instead of reaching for the measly half-pound of rations, he does something quite unexpected. He pulls out a small bag containing nearly half a pound of spirit rice he had saved from the previous month and respectfully presses it into Zhao Tieshan's hand. He tells the overseer that his work is exhausting and that since his own appetite has been poor lately, he'd like the master to have this rice instead. Zhao Taizhan is momentarily stunned. He weighs the bag, then bursts into a boisterous laugh, remarking that at least Yi Chinzhou knows how to show proper respect. He tells him to get back to work, and Yi Chinzhou bows repeatedly, agreeing with every word. He turns and leaves the administrative courtyard, maintaining his humble posture until he is well out of sight. The other laborers whisper that he must be crazy, asking why he gave away his savings and what he plans to eat now that Zhao Taizhan has bullied him so ruthlessly. Some suggest they should fight back, but others point out the absurdity of the idea. They are only at the 1st or 2nd level of qi refining, while the overseer is at the 4th. Yi Chinzhou tells them that if they want to fight, they can go ahead, but he intends to keep his life so he can keep chopping wood. And with that, he picks up his pace. We see Yi Chinzhou's fingers glowing with a dark, metallic sheen under the moonlight as he suddenly thrusts his hand into the earth, sinking his fingers deep into the hard soil. With a powerful tug, he rips out a massive chunk of dirt without even scratching his skin, his hands essentially transforming into a human excavator. He begins digging frantically beneath where his bed once stood, loading the soil into buckets to be dumped secretly off the nearby cliffs come morning. Half an hour later, a vertical pit 2 meters long, 1 meter wide, and 3 meters deep has taken shape, a hidden trap in the middle of his room. Even a mid-level chi refiner would break their neck falling down here. But for Yi Chinzhou, this is far from enough. He leaps out and selects a dozen pieces of hard black ironwood. He pulls a rusty iron sword from beneath his bed and activates his ultimate sharpness skill, his wrist flickering with practiced precision. Shadows dance as the hardwood is instantly carved into dozens of incredibly sharp, lethal spikes. Next, he retrieves a tattered paper bundle containing toxic powder he refined from the carcasses of dead rats and poisonous insects found while sweeping. The slightest touch of this powder causes total paralysis. Yi Chinzhou jumps back into the pit to arrange the poison and the deadly wooden spikes. He meticulously coats the entire bottom of the pit with these traps in a display of pure, calculated ruthlessness before dumping the final buckets of dirt over the cliff. After finishing, he doesn't rush back to rest. Instead, he brushes the dust from his hands and follows an overgrown path leading deeper into the back mountains. No one ever travels this way, mostly because of the moss-covered stone tablet standing at the entrance of the trail. The tablet bears 4 crookedly carved characters, Miasma Swamp Abyss. Everyone in the sect knows that what lies beyond this marker is a place of death. It is a toxic wasteland that has existed for untold years, perpetually shrouded in eerie purple and green vapors that feel distinctly unnatural. Low-level servants like them wouldn't dare approach, and even the senior disciples from the inner sect, those at the late or peak stages of chi refining, tread carefully here. It is said that the air itself is a weapon. A single breath of the concentrated waste can rot a person's lungs. There is a famous story about this place. An inner disciple once chased a rare poison-type beast into the swamp, only to vanish completely, leaving not even a whole corpse behind. Only a few blackened bone fragments were ever recovered from the swamp's edge. Since then, the area has been treated as a literal gate to the underworld. But as Yi Chinzhou watches the rolling mists ahead, his eyes burn with a feverish intensity. Where others see a grave, he sees an opportunity. He crushes some charcoal into a fine powder with a stone, then tears a thick piece of cloth from his bedding and wets it to create a makeshift filter. He wraps the charcoal tightly in the center of the cloth, finally finding a hollow reed to insert as a breathing tube for his makeshift creation. It is a crude, poorly made, but undoubtedly functional gas mask. Half an hour later, Yi Chinzhou stands before the stone tablet once more. He presses the cloth bundle against his face, tying it firmly behind his head and biting down on the tube before taking a deep breath. The air passing through the charcoal carries a smoky, earthy taste, but it filters out the most pungent odors. Without hesitation, he moves forward. He plunges headlong into the purple and green toxic mist. As he crosses the threshold, the exposed skin on his neck and arms begins to sting. It feels as if countless ants are gnawing at him. Even his skin, which had previously merged with the hardness attribute, begins to react. Unnatural faint streaks appear on the surface as the toxic gas attempts to seep into his pores. Yi Chinzhou doesn't panic, of course. Instead, he immediately issues an extraction command in his mind. The system panel flickers with a cold blue light, detecting the surrounding miasma. The mixed toxins are successfully extracted, granting him a point of poison resistance. Without a second thought, he chooses to merge it. He integrates the attribute into his skin and blood, and the stinging sensation instantly lessens. With a grin, he continues deeper into the abyss. The further he goes, the thicker the mist becomes. The surrounding trees have all turned a withered black, their branches bare and skeletal. Slimy green liquid drips from the trunks, and the ground is littered with the bleached bones of unknown beasts. Meanwhile, his notifications keep flashing. Poison resistance +1, +1, +2. The alerts are relentless. Yi Chinzhou moves like a tireless vacuum, harvesting everything in his path. He spends an hour circling the swamp's perimeter, frantically draining the toxins from the air. By now, the stinging on his body has vanished. The toxic vapors that would kill another man now feel like a gentle breeze against his skin, leaving not even a faint red mark. His poison resistance attribute has been forced up to a staggering 1,500 points. To be honest, he has nearly exhausted the outer mist. Since the attribute growth has slowed to a crawl, Yi Chinzhou turns his gaze toward the deeper parts of the swamp where no trees grow. There, only bubbling black mires remain. He steps carefully onto a patch of solid ground, approaching a basin-sized pool of mud. The pool gurgles with bubbles, emitting a nauseating, acidic stench. Suddenly, a stray gray rat scurries past the edge of the mire. The creature loses its footing and falls into the mud, letting out only a single, short shriek. In just 2 or 3 seconds, it is gone. The rat's skin and bones dissolve instantly into a pool of black water, leaving nothing behind. Yi Chinzhou feels his scalp tingle at the sight. But this doesn't scare him off. Instead, it makes his heart race. If he could extract this and use it as a weapon, then someone like Zhao Tai's Han, even at the 4th level, would be nothing. One slap, and he'd turn to ash. He doesn't dare touch it with his bare hands yet. He picks up a dry branch and lightly taps the surface of the mire. The moment the tip touches the mud, it makes a sizzling sound and emits a puff of white smoke. Yi Chinzhou immediately orders an extraction. The panel flashes, detecting a high-intensity corrosive substance. Extraction successful, corrosion +1. He chooses to merge it into the bones and skin of his index fingers, causing a very slight tingling sensation. He tosses away the remains of the half-dissolved branch and hovers his hands directly over the mire to begin a frantic extraction. Corrosion +1, +5, +10. The attributes soar. The black liquid in the mire turns clear at a visible speed, and that pungent, acidic stench vanishes along with it. By the time this pool is completely drained and turned into ordinary water, Yi Chenzhou's corrosion attribute has stacked up to 2,000 points. He stands up and looks at his hands, where his fingers now emit an eerie, ghostly green luster. He reaches out and lightly taps a fist-sized rock nearby. The stone's surface immediately smokes and begins to melt. A few seconds later, it's just a pool of bubbling gray water. Suddenly, the deafening sound of a bronze bell echoes from the main peak, continuous and loud. The entire Key Peak begins to bustle with excitement. Today is the sect's triennial outer disciple competition. It's the only day the laborers can openly slack off and join the crowd. The laborers, usually driven like pack mules by the overseers, head toward the front in groups. Yi Chenzhou, hurry up. If we're late, there won't even be standing room. An inner sect elder is watching, and even Sister Shun Qingxuang will be there. I can't. I ate some moldy food last night, and my stomach is turning. He acts like a lazy mule making excuses, and the others quickly disappear from sight. Seeing that Key Peak is finally empty, the pained expression on Yi Chenzhou's face instantly vanishes. Why watch a group of low-level amateurs peck at each other? After all, he has much better things to do. After all, what is there to see? If some hot-tempered senior disciple gets carried away in the heat of battle, a stray sword beam could easily fly into the stance. For a mere laborer, even a graze would cause a serious injury, and a direct hit would mean certain death. Seeking out that kind of excitement is just asking for trouble. Yi Chenzhou turns and heads straight for the peak. The task hall at the back of the mountain is deserted, save for a semi-bald man named Sun Jisher, who is currently dozing off at his desk. Since everyone else has run off to watch the competition, Yi Chenzhou steps forward and lightly taps the desk, announcing he is there to collect today's task. The man grumbles that the whole sect has a half-day holiday, wondering why anyone would want to work. Yi Chenzhou claims his talent is poor and his cultivation low. So if he isn't diligent, his spirit rice quota for next month might be cut again. He wants to use the quiet day to clear out the abandoned warehouse. His plan is to sweep out the scrap metal that has rotted to dust to make space. This, of course, is his true objective for the day. The abandoned warehouse sits in the darkest corner of the peak, a massive stone cavern that never sees the sun. Here, the sect's thousands of disciples leave behind countless broken magical tools from their battles and adventures. Those items that are beyond repair are simply tossed here like trash. As he pushes open the heavy, rusted iron door, a pungent smell of rust and mold hits him full force. Inside the cave, broken blades, spears, and shattered shields are piled up like small mountains. To anyone else, this is just a worthless junkyard. But in Yi Chenzhou's eyes, it is a massive gold mine without a single guard in sight. To be honest, it's a dream come true. Yi Chenzhou walks inside and firmly shuts the door behind him. Still feeling exposed, he decides to take an extra precaution and moves a nearby discarded furnace weighing several hundred pounds to block the entrance. Once he is certain no one can get in, he draws his own standard issue rusted iron sword from his waist. He approaches the nearest mountain of junk and picks up the broken half of a mountain-splitting saber. His panel flashes immediately. Detected damaged low-grade rank 1 magical tool. Extraction successful. He gains 1 point of sharpness and immediately orders it to be merged into the iron sword in his hand. The broken saber instantly dissolves into a pile of gray-white iron powder that slips through his fingers, while the rusted sword in his other hand gives a low hum. Without a moment's pause, he thrusts both hands into the pile of scrap metal and begins a frantic, unrestrained extraction process. As he sweeps through the room, the notification sounds on his panel blur into a single continuous tone. Sharpness +3, toughness +2, sharpness +1, and toughness +5. Wherever his hands reach, hundreds and thousands of broken magical tools react as if they were weathered fossils from 1,000 years ago, crumbling into a floor of fine powder. Chenzhou has become a human black hole among these thousands of relics, frantically extracting every bit of sharpness and toughness. 1 hour passes, then 2, and the mountains of junk in the warehouse begin to shrink at a speed visible to the naked eye. A thick layer of iron ash and impurities piles up on the floor. When he finally reaches the corner and turns the last cracked black iron shield into dust, he finally stops, exhaling a long, hot breath. To be honest, he looks exhausted. He is drenched in sweat, yet his spirit is soaring. He has squeezed the very last drop of value from thousands of broken tools. His sharpness and toughness attributes have skyrocketed by a staggering 30,000 points. Yi Chenzhou looks down at the rusted, standard issue iron sword in his right hand. He examines the blade with a quiet sense of satisfaction. We return to the outer sect task hall, where the atmosphere is significantly less peaceful than the quiet warehouse. It seems someone is nearly being beaten to death today. A man's scream echoes as he is thrown into the task notice board, shattering it. Blood splatters across the floor as two outer disciples, their eyes red with fury, draw their magical swords against one another. They are fighting over a task to guard the cold altar. It's a lucrative job that pays 10 spirit stones and offers a rare perk: half a month of free access to the dense spiritual energy near the altar. It is, quite literally, the best deal in the sect. One disciple roars that he saw the task first, arguing that since no names were on the board, it belongs to whoever can hold it. As their insults turn into a full-blown duel, a large crowd of disciples quickly gathers to watch the spectacle. Amidst the deafening shouts and clashing steel, Ichinjo keeps his hands tucked in his sleeves and his head down. Like a ghost, he hugs the wall and slips into the furthest corner of the hall, not even glancing at the two battered combatants. 10 spirit stones might sound like a fortune to some, but he knows they aren't worth a life. If he were to be crippled, the medical bills would likely cost far more than the reward. He skillfully makes his way to the most secluded task board. The wooden boards here are covered in a thick layer of dust, listing backbreaking chores that offer no spirit stones at all. His gaze sweeps past tasks like hauling manure and scrubbing monster pens, finally settling on a blackened wooden board, repairing the back mountain stairs. The reward is a measly 3 sect contribution points. To be honest, even a dog wouldn't take this job. The ancient stone steps have been neglected for years, and moving those massive slabs is exhausting work with 0 extra perks. Yet, Ichinjo looks at it as if he's found a legendary manual. He tears down the board and rushes to the counter. The clerk warns him that if the repairs aren't finished in 3 days, his monthly points will be docked. Shinjo simply smiles. The sleepy clerk glances up, stamps the permit, and hands over the tool slip. Shinjo turns and leaves immediately. He moves quickly, as if afraid the clerk might change his mind. Half an hour later, he stands at the foot of the back mountain. The place is truly deserted, without a soul in sight. Moss-covered steps wind their way up into the mountain mists. He drops his pickaxe and mortar, ignoring the broken slabs for a moment. He takes a deep breath and plants his feet. He presses his hands firmly against a massive, exposed vein of the mountain's bedrock. This is the very pulse of the earth. After millions of years of sedimentation, this mountain has no shortage of steady, solid power. His panel suddenly flickers to life. It detects a vast, continuous heaviness attribute. Extraction is successful, and he gains his first point of heaviness. Without a second thought, he orders the system to fuse the attribute into his skeleton and muscles. Suddenly, his legs feel incredibly heavy. It's as if he's carrying hundreds of pounds, yet when he tries to move, he finds his body is still surprisingly light. The weight is internal. It doesn't slow him down, but makes his lower body as stable as an ancient tree rooted in rock. Ichinjo begins his work. He lifts a broken stone slab weighing hundreds of pounds as easily as if it were a block of tofu. He tosses the debris aside, while keeping one hand pressed to the ground to continue the extraction. Heaviness +5, +10, +20. The notifications on his panel refresh frantically. Tasks that would normally require 5 men to lift are nothing to him now. He grabs a fresh slab with one hand and kicks it into place with perfect precision. But he isn't just working, he's evolving. He doesn't care at all about how fast the stairs are being repaired. His entire focus is on the attribute points skyrocketing. 1 day passes, then 2, and Ichinjo eats only mouthfuls of hard bread when hungry, drinks mountain spring water when thirsty, and naps briefly on the stone steps when exhausted. The power of the mountain's pulse is seemingly infinite, and this feeling of constantly gaining free attributes makes him feel like an addict. He simply cannot stop. Deep within his bones, a subtle crackling sound begins to echo. Beneath his skin, which had already fused with the hardness attribute, a steady, dark yellow luster begins to glow. His body density is increasing at an absolutely exaggerated and explosive rate. By the evening of the 3rd day, as the sun sets, Ichinjo kicks the final stone slab into place, fitting it perfectly with the others. He stands tall and exhales a long breath of white mist. The once dilapidated stone steps of the mountain have now, by his hands alone, been restored to a perfectly smooth state. But what truly excites him is the data on his panel: heaviness. He has reached exactly 10,000 points. Ichinjo clenches his fist, feeling as though he is a human mountain compressed to its absolute limit. He looks down at the blue stone beneath his feet, curious about what 10,000 points of heaviness concentrated in a human body actually means. He tries a small hop, and the entire ground of the back mountain shudders violently, letting out a dull, heavy thud. The sudden surge of power startled the bird spirits in the surrounding woods, sending them fluttering away in a chaotic panic. Ichinjo quickly withdrew his strength. He forcibly suppressed those 10,000 points of heavy attributes deep within his core. To be honest, if anyone had seen that just now, they would have surely mistaken him for some powerful transforming demon and dragged him off to be sliced up for research. He immediately grabbed his broom, acting as if nothing had happened, and wandered toward the back mountain. He found another secluded, shaded path to begin his daily sweeping duties. The commotion from fixing the stairs earlier had been a bit too loud for comfort, so he needed to do some chores to divert any unwanted attention. He hadn't been sweeping for even half an hour when the bushes beside the path suddenly erupted with heavy, ragged breathing, followed by the sharp crack of breaking branches. Yi Qingzhou's ears twitched, and his broom came to a sudden halt. A blood-soaked figure tumbled out from the undergrowth, collapsing headfirst onto the bluestone floor that Yi Qingzhou had just finished cleaning. A large crimson stain began to spread across the stone. Yi Qingzhou looked closer and noticed the man was wearing a distinctive moon-white, long robe, the unmistakable uniform of an inner sect disciple. However, the robe was now shredded into rags, and his chest bore a deep blade wound, and his left arm had been severed at the root. A strange, eerie black mist swirled around the injury. To survive such a wound was, frankly, a miracle. He was certainly stubborn enough to stay alive. The inner sect disciple struggled to lift his head, his face covered in mud as his watery eyes locked onto Yi Qingzhou. Trembling, he reached into his robes and pulled out a jade sword token stained with black blood and a storage ring. He stared intensely at the man holding the broom. In a raspy, desperate voice, he urged Yi Qingzhou to take these items and run to the front mountain immediately to find Elder Fong at the law enforcement hall. He told him to warn the elders that there was a traitor. If he could just deliver the message, the rewards would be beyond his wildest imagination. The spirit stones and pills inside the ring would all be his, and Elder Fong would even guarantee his entry into the inner sect. He promised him a life of wealth. Yi Qingzhou stood his ground, not even blinking as he looked at the shimmering storage ring. To be honest, most people would have been blinded by greed. But deep down, he didn't feel a single ripple of excitement. Had this been any other wide-eyed newcomer, they would surely be trembling with a hero complex right now. They would have grabbed the ring and rushed off to play the savior. But Yi Qingzhou saw the reality. An inner sect disciple of at least the late Qi refining stage had been butchered. If he was reduced to this pathetic state, the person hunting him had to be a truly ruthless character, likely at the Foundation establishment stage or even higher. For a lowly handyman like him to go poking his nose into the power struggles or blood feuds of the inner sect high-ranking officials was pure suicide. That jade sword token was nothing more than a death warrant, and the storage ring likely carried a spiritual mark or some other tracking method. Whoever took it would be the next to die. In a major sect like this, the inner disciples were closely monitored, and their final moments were rarely private. The last image they saw or the killer's aura would almost certainly be transmitted back to their soul lamp. It was a perfect trap for the unwary. To risk his life for a bit of scrap metal and some pills seemed utterly brainless to him. And so, Yi Qingzhou didn't say a single word. Even the rhythm of his breathing remained unchanged. He didn't step forward to help, nor did he try to take advantage of the situation. He simply stepped back. He took a single step away, tightening his grip on his broom. Seeing him retreat, the disciple grew frantic, coughing up another mouthful of black blood. He screamed for him to take the items, his voice full of life and death desperation. But Yi Qingzhou ignored him completely and turned to walk away. He didn't just leave, however, he began to sweep with professional precision. As he moved, he used his broom to follow the path of his own retreat. He swept layers of fallen leaves and dust over the ground, perfectly concealing the footprints where he had just been standing. The broom hissed against the stone. The sound of the broom against the ground felt strangely out of place in these gloomy woods, as the inner sect disciple began to curse him in utter despair. The man's voice grew weaker and weaker, but Yi Qingzhou remained completely deaf to the insults. Let him curse. It didn't matter in the slightest. Being yelled at wouldn't cost him a piece of flesh, after all. He took a detour toward the thick brush, swiftly leveling the ground as he retreated. He even used his broom to nudge every broken blade of grass back into its original position, leaving no abnormal creases behind as he withdrew. After retreating about 10 meters, Yi Qingzhou ducked low and slipped into a patch of waist-high weeds. He then activated his 10,000 points of heavy attribute. He released just a tiny sliver of that power to suppress his own heartbeat and slow his blood flow, crouching low against the muddy earth. His presence vanished, leaving him as cold and silent as a buried stone. Not 10 breaths after he had hidden himself, 3 dark figures appeared. They descended like ghosts from the sky, landing beside the dying disciple as a thick, malevolent aura instantly blanketed the entire area. The temperature in the air seemed to drop several degrees. These men in black rushed to the scene, their eyes darting around as they searched the clearing. They were completely unaware of Yi Qingzhou, who sat motionless in the grass just 10 meters away. The 3 men searched the immediate area thoroughly. After searching for a long time, they found nothing but the disciple's body and scattered black leaves. They wondered why the items weren't on the boy. One suggested a passing beast might have snatched them, but the leader snapped at him to shut up, ordering them to dispose of the body and retreat. He warned that the law enforcement hall would smell the blood soon. The men efficiently poured a bone-melting liquid, creating a cloud of pungent yellow smoke. Yi Qingzhou remained motionless in the weeds, refusing to rush out. He stayed crouched in that nest for a full 2 hours, waiting for the sky to turn black. Only when the mountain went silent, without even a bird's cry, did he finally stand and brush the dirt from his clothes. He couldn't help but sigh at the situation. He remarked quietly on how ruthless those people were before shouldering his broom and slipping away down a deserted, narrow path. He ran like the wind back to his dilapidated shack, locking the door tight and even shoving a table against it. Today's events had served as a grim wake-up call. The sect was becoming increasingly unstable if people dared to murder inner disciples so brazenly on the back mountain. He looked down at his floorboards. That 3-meter-deep spike trap was meant to catch intruders, but that only worked if someone actually stepped inside the house first. If they found him a nuisance and simply set the hut on fire or leveled it with a spell from outside, his trap would be entirely useless. If the house collapsed, he would be buried alive in his own trap. He realized he had to reinforce this hut. He had to stack defenses until they were unbreakable. Yi Chinzhou set to work immediately, dragging out several cracked jars from beneath his bed. These were filled with materials he had gathered earlier from abandoned sites. Inside was the grayish-white metal powder left over after he had frantically extracted attributes from broken magical tools. These scraps, though they had lost their edge and their toughness, were still made of iron, steel, or even higher-grade phosphorus ore. They were, quite frankly, perfect for use as array-forming materials. He found another chipped jar, poured in half a bowl of water, and dumped all the metal powder inside to create a base for his work. Then, he bit his finger and squeezed a few drops of blood into the bowl, stirring it vigorously with a chopstick. Soon, a bowl of thick, black, mud-like array ink was ready. Yi Chinzhou didn't know any profound techniques. The tattered manual he owned only contained 2 of the most basic arrays, one to keep rats out of rice jars, and another for hiding the smell of latrines. Normally, no one would take these pathetic, weak arrays seriously. But Yi Chinzhou didn't care. If quality was lacking, he would simply make up for it with sheer quantity. He squatted down and began painting the warding array onto the underside of the floorboards, stroke by stroke. The pattern was incredibly simple, just a few nested circles and 12 radiating lines. Even the slowest worker could draw it. However, after finishing the first one, he didn't stop. He immediately began a second one right next to the edge. Then a third and a fourth. He flipped the floorboards over and covered the entire back surface with dense patterns. He drew 50 of them in total, 50 low-level arrays stacked onto a single piece of wood. A single array had the defensive power of a thin sheet of iron, but 50 of them stacked together? That was like having 50 layers of iron welded onto the board. After the floor, he moved on to the walls. He dismantled the wall planks one by one, covered their backs with arrays, and then carefully reinstalled them. From the outside, the shack still looked like a pile of junk ready to collapse, but inside, it was a different story. Every inch of wood was covered in black lines that shimmered faintly in the dark. Next, he started on the door and window frames. Next, he began drawing the concealment arrays. It was the same process, and frankly, the same level of madness. 50 arrays stacked in every single spot. Once finished, the entire wooden hut felt as if it were gripped by an invisible shroud. From the outside, a passerby wouldn't even be able to tell if someone inside was breathing. Yi Chinzhou finished the final stroke, straightened his back, and looked upon his masterpiece with quiet pride. He nodded in satisfaction. To any outsider, this shack remained the most broken, dilapidated, and unremarkable shed in all of Kiafeng. It creaked whenever the wind blew, and the cracks in the door were wide enough to fit a hand through. But in reality, the defensive power of this room was now comparable to a small fortress, with 50 layers of wall-solidifying arrays stacked together. Even a late-stage chi refiner striking it with a sword would likely see sparks fly, and the 3-meter trap below ensured no intruder would return. 50 layers of chi-concealing arrays swallowed every trace of life within. Yi Chinzhou placed the wooden boards back over the bed area, spreading his bedding over them. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary, broken wooden bed. No one would ever suspect that. Beneath those boards lay a 3-meter-deep death trap filled with poison spikes. He lay down on the bed and closed his eyes. A faint smile touched his lips. In this cutthroat world of cultivation, if one wants to survive, they must arm themselves to the teeth. On the surface, he was Kiafeng's most invisible nobody. In the shadows, however, his little shack had been transformed into a meat grinder where people enter but never leave. As long as he stayed cautious, his attribute panel would continue to stack his hidden trump cards. Only when his attributes reached a point where even a golden core cultivator couldn't touch him would he truly show his fangs. Until then, Yi Chinzhou was content to be the most honest, useless, and forgettable salted fish in all of Kiafeng. No one could make him stand out, and no one could make him take a risk. He rolled over under his warm quilt, and, under the heavy protection of 50 layers of solidifying and concealing arrays, he drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep. Outside, the moonlight filtered through the cracks in the door, falling across his calm face. The night in Kiafeng was as quiet as ever. No one knew that within this broken hut lived a monster who was silently growing stronger, and no one suspected that the thin, hunched servant sweeping floors and chopping would already possessed enough power to crush a peak chi refinement expert. And this was only the beginning. We see him layering wall-solidifying arrays over concealment arrays, nesting small formations within larger ones in a complex web. An hour passed, and the arrays on the wall boards had already reached 10 layers. The musty smell inside the wooden hut completely vanished. and even the sound of his heavy breathing was trapped. As long as he stayed inside, not a single sound would reach the outside world. But, to be honest, this still wasn't enough for him. Yi Chinzhou held his broken bowl, dipped his brush, and continued. 20 layers, 30, 40. Sweat dripped from his chin and his wrist trembled with exhaustion, yet his eyes grew increasingly excited. The specialized metallic ink was being drawn by the power of the formations, seeping deep into every grain of the wood. This ordinary, rotting timber was undergoing a truly bizarre transformation. Just as dawn was breaking, he finally finished the last stroke. He had stacked exactly 50 layers of solidifying and concealing arrays, locking them tightly onto this 10 square meter shack. Yi Chinzhou tossed aside his worn-out brush, collapsed onto the floor, and gasped for air. He looked around at his work. From the outside, the wooden hut still looked like a dilapidated wreck ready to collapse in the wind. Not a single trace of the formations could be seen on the walls as the concealment arrays perfectly masked every ripple of spiritual energy. Yi Chinzhou stood up and walked to the wall directly facing the door. Taking a deep breath, he instantly activated the heaviness attribute in his legs and the hardness attribute in his hands. He was, after all, a monster who had fused 10,000 points of heaviness and thousands of hardness. A single punch from him could turn a 1,000-pound boulder into dust. He twisted his waist and threw a right hook that tore through the air with a piercing whistle, slamming it into the wall. The hut looked like it might fall over, yet after his full power strike, not even a splinter of wood fell off. Yi Chinzhou rubbed his slightly numb knuckles, looking with satisfaction at the wooden boards that hadn't even lost a flake of paint. With 50 layers of arrays stacked up, he figured this wall was likely tougher than an elder's defensive magic treasure. He had his safe house now, but deep down, he still didn't feel entirely at ease. No matter how hard the hut was, he couldn't hide inside forever without doing his chores. If he were caught outside in the crossfire of high-level cultivators, a stray sword beam could be disastrous. His body was tough, but it certainly wouldn't be pleasant. He needed more protection. He decided that the best trump card for survival was one he could wear. Over the years, by being incredibly frugal and saving every penny, he had managed to scrape together about a dozen spirit stones. Of course, at the sect's official treasure pavilion. That wouldn't even buy the hilt of a low-grade artifact. His only choice was to try his luck at the stalls in the Fong clan's outer market. The market sat in a vast valley between the front and back mountains. Yi Chinzhou changed into his most tattered gray clothes, messed up his hair, and kept his head low as he blended into the bustling crowd. On both sides of the street stood grand shops, where elegant female cultivators stood at the doors to welcome guests. He didn't even glance at them, walking straight through the main street and ducking into the deepest, dirtiest corner of the market known as the Old Firebox. Here, vendors simply spread out tattered cloths, covered in a chaotic mess of items, chipped flying swords, blackened unknown herbs, and even muddy monster bones. Most of these stall owners were older disciples who hadn't fared well, or low-level students desperate for quick cash. The air was thick with the sounds of shouting, haggling, and general chaos. Yi Chinzhou tucked his hands into his sleeves, wandering from stall to stall like a man with nowhere to be. He didn't even look at the shiny, decent-looking items. Those had already been scanned 1,000 times by others. If there were any hidden gems, they wouldn't be left for him. Besides, they were too expensive and would draw unwanted attention. Instead, he looked for scrap metal and broken stones, the kind of junk even the owners couldn't identify. After wandering for nearly an hour, Yi Chinzhou finally stopped in front of a ragged straw mat in a quiet corner. The owner was a thin, monkey-like older disciple, who was currently dozing off against a wall. On the mat lay a few rusted iron shards and some ruined talismans. Essentially worthless trash. Yi Chinzhou crouched down and casually poked at the iron shards, pretending to be mildly interested, while his gaze drifted toward a black lump used to weigh down the corner of the mat. It was only the size of a fist, dark and pitted with no spiritual energy whatsoever. To any passerby, it looked like nothing more than waste from a forge. It looked like mere slag, but as he approached, the attribute extraction panel deep in his mind did something incredibly rare. It gave a slight, subtle twitch. This meant that hidden within this piece of waste was something that even the panel found interesting. Yi Chinzhou picked up a rusted iron shard, weighing it in his hand while intentionally frowning as he asked for the price. The monkey-like vendor glanced at his servant robes and lazily called out 5 spirit stones. 5. Yi Chinzhou tossed the iron shard back onto the mat, complaining it was too expensive and turning to leave. Seeing his sale slipping away, the vendor quickly sat up straight and dropped the price to 3. Yi Chinzhou stopped in his tracks and let out a long, calculated sigh. He told the man he'd take it, provided he could have that broken stone weighing down the mat to prop up his broken bed frame. He tossed the black lump in his hand twice. It was surprisingly heavy and ice cold. He quickly counted out 3 spirit stones, pressed them into the vendor's hand, and grabbed the black lump and the iron shards before vanishing back into the crowd. The vendor stared at the stones in his hand, then looked toward the direction where Yi Chinzhou had disappeared, chuckling to himself. He wondered where such a fool had come from, treating a piece of common iron slag like a precious treasure. Half an hour later, we returned to that supposedly impregnable wooden shack, where Yi Chinzhou locked the door and pulled the window shutters tight. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, he tossed the rusted iron shards aside and held the black lump with both hands. He took a deep breath and issued the extraction command in his mind. Suddenly, the panel erupted with a ghostly blue light, far more piercing than anything we've seen before. It had detected a high-purity ancient rune fragment and was currently stripping away the impurities. Dense cracks began to spiderweb across the surface of the black lump. Layers of dark crust, like dried mud, began to peel off and turn into powder, slipping through his fingers. In less than 3 breaths, the fist-sized lump had shrunk down to a tiny, shimmering object no larger than a fingernail. It wasn't just a simple attribute, but a complex, blood-red rune that looked like a miniature formation. It hovered half an inch above his palm, radiating a violent aura that made his heart skip a beat. The panel announced a successful extraction. He had obtained a special rare trait called the Thorn Rune. Its effect was simple. When suffering a physical or spiritual attack, it would instantly reflect 100% of the absorbed damage back to the attacker. Yi Chenzhou could only gasp in disbelief. His eyes widened in an instant. A 100% damage reflection meant that as long as an opponent couldn't kill him with a single strike, even if they were a powerful cultivator, they would still have to endure the full weight of their own attack. To be honest, it's a terrifying prospect. Combined with his 10,000 points of thickness and thousands of points of hardness, he was essentially a human fortress. Whoever hit him was in for a bad time. The panel prompted him to choose a fusion site. Yi Chenzhou pulled open his tattered gray outer tunic, revealing a rough, thin leather vest underneath. It was a second-hand piece, washed white and covered in patches, which he had traded for using some basic materials when he first joined the sect. Without a moment's hesitation, he fused the Thorn Rune directly into this inner armor. A strange, dark red luster immediately rippled across the surface of the leather. Then, the glow faded, and it returned to its usual, shabby appearance. A perfect disguise, wouldn't you say? Early the next morning, we find Yi Chenzhou carrying 2 large wooden buckets to the forest fields to water the crops, just like any other day. The sun was piercingly bright, and the air was stiflingly hot, without even a hint of a breeze to offer relief. Suddenly, a dull, mournful horn blast echoed from deep within the back mountains. It was shrill and piercing, carrying an immense power. This was not the usual bell used to summon disciples. Yi Chenzhou paused, his grip on the wooden yoke tightening as he looked up toward the sound. Then, the ground began to vibrate. At first, it was just a faint tremor that sent ripples across the water in his buckets, but within a few breaths, the shaking intensified, sounding as if hundreds or even thousands of warhorses were charging at full speed. Zhou Dazhuang straightened his back, looking toward the mountains with a confused expression, wondering if the earth dragon was turning over. Suddenly, a sharp-eyed servant screamed. He pointed toward the perimeter of the forest, where the defensive barricades, made of thick ironwood and standing 2 men high, were being shattered. They were torn apart like paper. Amidst the flying wood chips, a dozen beasts the size of small calves emerged, their eyes glowing a feral crimson. Carrying a foul wind, they charged directly into the crowd of servants. These were the spirit beasts from the mountain. They had gone mad. The spirit beasts were rioting, and the entire forest field instantly descended into chaos. Even the low-level beasts usually used for pulling carts had lost all reason. Leading the charge were several first-rank steel-toothed boars, their bodies covered in hard black bristles and tusks longer than daggers. They lowered their heads and charged at anyone in sight. One elderly servant, who was a bit too slow to react, didn't even have time to scream. He didn't even have time to scream before a steel-toothed boar slammed into his waist, sending him flying. The servants completely collapsed in terror. At best, their cultivation was only at the 2nd or 3rd level of chi refining, hardly enough to cast a decent spell. Their only weapons were hoes and sickles. Against a pack of frenzied spirit beasts, it was a total slaughter. In an instant, the entire scene turned into a chaotic mess. Some fled toward the mountain, others scrambled for the huts, and some were simply paralyzed by fear. Yi Chenzhou, however, stood his ground. His brow furrowed, but he didn't run. In this kind of chaos, showing your back to a 4-legged beast is essentially a death sentence. 2 legs can never outrun 4, after all. Yet, he knew he couldn't actually fight back either. To him, these low-level beasts were like paper. He could have knocked the life out of that boar with a single punch. But then what? A riot of sect spirit beasts is no small matter. It was highly likely that an elder was circling above on a flying sword, scanning the chaos with their divine sense. He had to be careful. If a lowly first-level servant were seen killing a first-rank beast with one blow, he'd find himself strapped to a dissection table by tomorrow morning. Since he couldn't fight and couldn't run, Yi Chenzhou scanned his surroundings. Nearby, several fisher wolves had just pounced on some fleeing servants. The wolves were savagely pinning them down. 4 or 5 servants already lay there, completely unconscious and broken. Yi Chenzhou took a deep breath and charged toward them without a second thought. To be clear, he wasn't going there to play the hero. He was simply looking for a place to hide. Reaching the fallen men, he stepped into a dark puddle and reached down to the blood-stained earth. He smeared the dark blood across his face, neck, and hands. Then, with a sharp tug, he ripped the fabric of his chest and sleeves into tatters. He was disguising his clothes to look as if they had been shredded by claws. His movements were fluid, practiced, and remarkably calm. With his disguise complete, Yi Chinzhou threw himself onto the ground next to the fallen servants, playing dead and remaining perfectly still. He even paid attention to the details, draping a torn piece of clothing over his back and burying half his face in the mud, leaving only a nostril clear to breathe. He used his 10,000 points of thickness to forcefully slow his heartbeat and blood flow. His breathing became nearly imperceptible, and his body temperature dropped. Now, even if someone checked his pulse, they would find nothing. They would assume he was just another fresh corpse. Around him, the screams continued as the sound of tearing flesh filled the air. The sound of spirit beasts crunching on bone was mere inches away. Hu Yefeng had transformed into a literal slaughterhouse, the sharp scent of blood filling the air. The smell only served to drive the beasts into a deeper frenzy. Like bulldozers, they trampled everything in their path, wooden huts and forest fields alike. Yi Chinzhou, however, kept his eyes shut, his mind as calm as a still lake. He knew he only had to endure this wave until the sect's formation teams and inner disciples arrived. Once they appeared, these low-intelligence beasts would be suppressed instantly. For now, he just needed to be a quiet, convincing piece of background scenery, a corpse. Suddenly, a heavy, foul-smelling breath puffed against his ear. The ground began to vibrate with the rhythmic thud of massive footsteps approaching the pile of bodies. A massive spirit beast strolled over to the heap of fallen servants, its heavy hooves making a wet, squelching sound as they sank into the bloody mud. Yi Chinzhou felt a wet, sandpaper-rough tongue lick the corpse lying right next to him. It happened twice, as if the beast were tasting the meat for freshness. The creature's snout moved closer to where Yi Chinzhou lay, sniffing the air with loud, wet snorts. It was clearly searching for the choicest cut of the day. A blast of hot, stinking breath hit the back of his neck. This was a mid-grade, first-rank armored bear, a creature far more dangerous than the boars. It was larger than a full-grown bull, covered in fur that stood up like steel needles. To be honest, it was the last thing anyone would want to encounter. These beasts are not just incredibly strong, they are notoriously thick-skinned. When they go into a rage, even late-stage qi-refining cultivators hesitate to face them head-on. Yet, Yi Chinzhou remained as still as a stone, his eyelids not even flickering. The armored bear let out a low, guttural growl from deep within its throat. It raised a massive paw, larger than a human head and caked in dried mud, and brought it down with terrifying force toward the corpse on the ground. That single strike carried at least 1,000 pounds of force. On any ordinary servant, it would have shattered their spine and pulverized their internal organs instantly. But in the millisecond before the paw made contact with Yi Chinzhou's back, something hidden beneath his tattered clothes reacted. A secret was about to be revealed. On the surface of the ragged beast skin inner armor he wore, a faint and incredibly subtle blood-red rune flashed with a sudden, ominous light. A notification appeared in his mind. External physical attack detected. Damage reflection rune activated. It seemed his preparations were paying off. The rune would reflect 100% of the damage, combined with Yi Chinzhou's 10,000 points of thickness and 1,000 points of hardness. He was now less like a human and more like an anvil forged from eternal black iron. He was effectively bolted to the very earth itself. The armored bear slammed its heavy paw onto this human anvil. In that instant, the rune perfectly captured every ounce of the massive counterforce. The rune gathered that energy and violently unleashed it back. A bone-chilling crack suddenly rang out, drowning out the surrounding cries of agony. The armored bear didn't even have time to scream before its thick right arm, from the paw all the way to the shoulder, exploded as if it were packed with dynamite. Debris flew everywhere as the hard arm bones shattered instantly. Hundreds of sharp bone fragments sprayed outward like shrapnel. Within a single second, half of its arm had been shaken into a dark mist by its own strength. The massive counterforce didn't just ruin its arm, however, it traveled through the shoulder blade to destroy its internal organs. Only then did the armored bear let out a piercing, final wail of despair. Its massive body was tossed back like a tattered sack of grain, flying 2 meters through the air before crashing into the forest fields and crushing a wide path in the muddy water. It thrashed and rolled frantically, its left claw scratching at the ground while it coughed up a dark fluid mixed with shattered bits of organ. After struggling for less than 10 breaths, it went completely still. It was dead. Meanwhile, lying in the pile of corpses, Yi Chinzhou didn't even blink. When that massive paw struck him, he felt as if someone had given his back a gentle, firm massage, not a scratch on him. The unlucky bear, on the other hand, had essentially killed itself. Yi Chinzhou continued to play dead, waiting for the sect's formation teams to clean up the mess. The dead bear lying just 2 meters away actually provided him with the perfect cover. Other spirit beasts nearby, hearing their kin's horrific death cry, felt a flicker of primal fear. They instinctively avoided Yi Chinzhou's area, turning instead to hunt the servants who were still running around in a panic. A short while later, a series of sharp, whistling sounds suddenly echoed over Hu Yefeng. Over a dozen dazzling streaks of swordlight cut through the sky like meteors, carrying a chilling, killing intent as they hovered in midair. Leading them was an inner disciple from the formation hall, dressed in black-trimmed robes. His foundation establishment Pressure was released without restraint, forcing the low-level beasts below to huddle on the ground, trembling. He gave a cold command to kill them all and leave none alive. Behind him, the dozen disciples of the formation team moved simultaneously. Fingers dancing through sword seals, they sent their blades whistling across Huyefeng like streaks of light, decapitating the massive spirit beasts. One after another, these creatures, who had seemed like gods of death to the servants, were as fragile as autumn leaves. Before the sex elite, in less than the time it takes to drink a cup of tea, the beasts were slaughtered, and the lead deacon coldly ordered his team to clear the field, treat the wounded, and collect the carcasses. The valuable inner galls and pelts were to be sent directly to the sect's treasury. With his orders given, he flew off to inspect other areas, leaving several formation disciples to descend into the muddy, blood-stained fields with looks of pure disgust on their faces. One particularly stout disciple couldn't help but complain about how useless the servants were, noting that a few low-level beasts had managed to kill so many of them while he kicked aside the debris. As the two of them picked their way through the carnage, they soon arrived at the pile of bodies where Yi Qinzhou was hiding. The taller disciple suddenly stopped, pointing at the armored bear's corpse and calling his companion over. They both knelt beside the massive frame, staring at the shattered right side of its body in utter confusion. They simply couldn't fathom how the creature had managed to vibrate itself to death. The tall one poked at the heap of splintered bone with his sword, muttering that it was truly bizarre, as if the bear had gone so berserk that its own spiritual energy had simply exploded. Its entire right arm and half its ribs were reduced to sand. A pathetic way to go, really. The stout disciple stood further back, covering his nose, and argued that it didn't matter. Low-level beasts often lost control and self-destructed. They quickly got to work with their skinning knives, harvesting the intact pelt and the valuable gall from the armored bear's remains. The stout one even managed to sneak the intact left paw into his storage bag, likely planning a gourmet dinner for later that evening. Just as the two were preparing to mount their swords and move to the next sector, a weak, trembling sound drifted up from the pile of corpses. Yi Qinzhou, timing his performance perfectly, opened his eyes. His face was covered in filth, and his body shook violently like a leaf in the wind. He began scrambling backward through the mud using both hands and feet, screaming in a voice filled with feigned terror, "Don't eat me. My meat is sour. It tastes terrible." To be perfectly honest, his display of a man who had completely lost his soul to fear was more convincing than someone who was actually insane. The tall disciple glanced at him with a cold, mocking sneer and told him to pipe down. The disciple told him to stop shouting, as the beasts were all dead. He noted that the boy was lucky to have survived by hiding under the corpses. He was told to head to the administration office for medicine. Without another glance, the two cultivators transformed into streaks of light and took to the sky. Yi Qinzhou sat in the mud, watching them vanish. The moment they were gone, his expression of terror vanished completely, replaced by a calm, calculating gaze. He slowly wiped the filth from his face and stood up. It had taken nearly an hour for the spirit beast riot to be fully suppressed by the sect. Huyefeng was left in ruins, with casualties scattered everywhere. It took an entire day just to clear the debris, and by the following morning, the supervisor, Zhao Taizhan, looked absolutely miserable. Dozens of servants in his sector were dead, and the spirit fields were almost entirely trampled. He knew the higher-ups would hold him responsible for the loss. To maintain order, the outer sect elders did something rare and authorized a relief fund. Yi Qinzhou joined the queue to collect his share, intentionally making himself look disheveled and broken as he shuffled forward. He walked with a heavy limp, his eyes wandering aimlessly while he muttered nonsense about bears. When it was finally his turn, the clerk checked the register and looked up at his pathetic state. He was officially recorded as a survivor of the disaster zone. Deemed to be suffering from extreme shock, he was given 10 low-grade spirit stones, 2 bottles of healing pills, and 3 days of rest. Yi Qinzhou reached out with a hand that was trembling uncontrollably. It was a masterful performance, really. Without wasting a second, he took the resources and slipped away from Huyefeng, heading straight for the Fong family shops in the front mountains. He possessed incredible attributes now, but his physical body was still that of a weak, first-level chi refiner. He needed to refine these powers. If he didn't integrate them into his marrow, a true master could shatter his internal organs with a single spell, even if his skin remained intact. He required a complete physical reconstruction. Upon arriving at the shop, he went straight to the section for body-tempering materials. He slapped his 10 spirit stones onto the counter with surprising confidence, demanding 5 jars of the strongest flame's spirit blood. He also requested 10 packs of bone-breaking grass and iron skin herbs, insisting on the oldest stock. The shopkeeper looked at this ragged boy and hesitated for a moment, but following the principle that gold is gold regardless of who brings it, he smiled and packed everything up. After buying his materials, Yi Qinzhou jogged along the base of the walls until he slipped back into his room, protected by 50 layers of formations. He pushed aside the bed to reveal a 3-meter-deep hole. Jumping inside, he carefully swept away the poison powder and wooden spikes he had laid earlier. From his storage bag, he dragged out a large wooden tub he'd scavenged from somewhere and placed it right in the center of the pit. He dumped all 10 packs of bone-breaking grass and iron skin herbs into the tub, followed by 5 jars of violent flame spirit blood. Using a fire starter, he lit a blaze beneath the tub. Before long, the dark red medicinal liquid began to boil and bubble intensely. A pungent, fishy stench mixed with a heavy medicinal aroma began to fill the underground chamber. It was a truly overwhelming scent, to be honest. Any ordinary first-level chi refiner would be torn apart by such a violent concentration of medicinal power the moment they stepped inside. But Yi Chenzhou didn't care. He quickly stripped off his outer robe and even the inner armor inscribed with the reflection runes. Taking a deep breath, he plunged into the scalding, boiling liquid. The moment he entered, the sensation was overwhelming. It felt as if countless red-hot needles were frantically piercing his pores as the violent energy of the tiger blood forced its way into his veins. With his eyes wide, Yi Chenzhou let out a silent roar in his mind, commanding the system panel to smash all his attributes into his marrow. The panel acknowledged the command and initiated a deep reconstruction, issuing a stern warning that the process would involve extreme pain. It advised him to remain conscious throughout. The boiling liquid acted as the perfect catalyst and buffer for the transformation. His attributes, hardness, poison resistance, heaviness, and reflection, began to fuse completely with his skeleton. It was a brutal process, naturally. Yi Chenzhou endured the reconstruction, lying motionless for 2 full days and nights before he finally managed to regain his senses. The violent medicinal power had been forcibly crushed by the system and hammered into every inch of his marrow and flesh. The results were staggering. His heaviness, hardness, and poison resistance had merged into a single, unified foundation of strength. If he returned to the back mountains now, he wouldn't even need his hands. He could likely headbutt a mountain in half. Imagine that. Late that night, dark clouds obscured the moon and stars. In the pitch-black woods surrounding the back mountains, the insects suddenly went silent. A figure shrouded in a black robe stumbled out from the thickets, gasping for air as they collapsed onto the forest floor. He collapsed face first into the mud, gasping for air as a pungent, rotting stench immediately began to fill the night breeze. Through gritted teeth, he cursed the mad dogs of the Tianxian sect's punishment hall for chasing him so relentlessly. Under the faint moonlight, we see that half of his face is covered in dried, purple-black filth, with a deep sword wound on his ribs. Black smoke hissed from the edges of the bone-deep gash, refusing to heal. This man was a demonic cultivator known as Chi-Mo. With an 8th-level Qi refinement cultivation, Chi-Mo had originally planned to sneak into Tianxian territory to harvest the essence of outer disciples. Instead, he was caught red-handed by the inner sect elites and pursued by 3 flying swords for a full day and night. He had exhausted every trump card and suffered heavy injuries just to reach this neglected corner of the labor quarters. His demonic energy was fading, and if he didn't find a blood bag to replenish himself soon, he knew he wouldn't survive the night. His bloodshot, triangular eyes scanned the nearby servant shacks like a starving wolf. In his current state, escape was impossible. He desperately needed a scapegoat, someone whose essence he could drain to heal while using their body as a decoy. By dressing a victim in his black robes and faking his own death, he hoped to shed his skin and vanish like a cicada. Chi-Mo's gaze swept over the rows of dilapidated wooden huts. He couldn't pick anyone with a high cultivation. It would cause too much noise. Suddenly, his eyes locked onto the most isolated and broken shack in the corner. To be honest, it looked barely standing. This was, of course, Yi Chenzhou's residence. Chi-Mo let out a sinister chuckle and licked his cracked, dry lips. The hut looked like it hadn't been maintained in centuries, suggesting its occupant was likely a bottom-tier weakling who couldn't even afford spirit rice. His figure blurred as he glided across the ground like a night owl, silently approaching the wooden door. He didn't rush in, instead extending his divine sense to scan the area. He detected no formations, just ordinary, rotting wood. It seemed pathetically poor. Little did he know, Yi Chenzhou's 50 layers of concealment arrays had masked every trace of spiritual energy. To a late-stage Qi refiner like Chi-Mo, this appeared to be nothing more than a trash heap. Fearing the door might creak, he reached into his robes. He pulled out a crumpled Earth Escape talisman and slapped it onto himself, instantly transforming into a shadow to slip inside. The dim shadow slithered beneath the door crack like flowing water, bypassing the 50 layers of concealment arrays that were designed to block physical objects. However, those defenses weren't built for underhanded tricks like the 5 elements escape. Yi Chenzhou stepped forward, looking down at the now severed body on the floor. Chi-Mo was dead, his eyes still staring wide in a final, frozen expression of shock. Leaving the corpse of a late-stage demonic cultivator in his room would be a disaster. The stench of blood was far too heavy, and it would undoubtedly attract the overseers or the defense teams by morning. Without hesitation, he reached out his right hand. He hovered his palm over Chi-Mo's remains and issued the extraction command. A panel flickered to life, detecting a high-concentration mixture of demonic energy and blood. The system confirmed the target was deceased and began stripping away the impurities to refine the essence. It was a cold, efficient process. As the blue light of the panel pulsed, the two gruesome halves of the corpse, along with the spilled blood, began to change. The shattered organs and even the black robes began to weather and disintegrate at a visible speed. In less than a few breaths' time, a full-grown man had completely vanished, leaving not a single drop of blood behind. In his place, something new remained. A small pile of dark red powder now rested in Yi Chinzhou's palm, emitting an incredibly dense and pure spiritual aura of vegetation. There wasn't even a hint of a bloody scent. This was the essence of an 8th-level Qi refiner's entire cultivation and physical form, condensed into a handful. Yi Chinzhou casually tucked Qi Mo's shriveled storage bag into his robes, making sure to keep his newfound spoils hidden. He found a scrap of cloth to carefully wrap the powder, then moved with practiced agility to pick up the broken wooden boards of his wall. He resealed the gap with mud and a few iron nails, adding a few simple illusion arrays for good measure. By the time he finished, the first light of dawn was just beginning to touch the horizon. The next morning, Yi Chinzhou appeared in the spirit fields right on time to water the crops. The demonic cultivator who had been so terrifying the night before had been refined into a handful of nutrient-rich fertilizer buried deep within the soil. A few months later, in the bitter winds of the spirit fields, the few acres under Yi Chinzhou's care showed growth that was frankly staggering. The stalks were as thick as small saplings, and the golden marrow within was so saturated with spiritual energy it nearly dripped. Overseer Zhao Taizhan stood on the ridge, his face twitching with a wide, greedy grin at the sight of the harvest. He did something unprecedented and patted Yi Chinzhou on the shoulder. Tossing a half-piece of spirit stone in his hand, he told him he'd done well. This field's output had more than covered the previous deficits. The surplus not only covered the debt, but also earned the overseer some prestige with his superiors. He declared that Yi Chinzhou was now tied to this field. He warned that if anyone dared to cause trouble for Yi Chinzhou, they would have to answer to him. Our protagonist accepted the half-piece of spirit stone with both hands. Bowing low with a simple, honest smile, he thanked the overseer for the promotion, claiming he had no ambition beyond working these fields. After Zhao Taizhan left, humming a little tune with his hands behind his back, Yi Chinzhou slowly straightened his spine. He casually tucked that meager fragment of stone into his pocket. He picked up a long-handled wooden ladle nearby, scooped a generous portion of spiritual spring water, and began unhurriedly watering the very center of the field. He focused on the roots of the thickest, most robust stalks. Deep within the soil, a faint trace of dark red demonic energy, detectable only to him, began to shimmer. This was the final remnant of Qi Mo's essence as a demonic cultivator. However, the moment this aura tried to surface, Yi Chinzhou acted. A heavy, grounding force seeped from the soles of his feet, pinning the energy down and crushing it instantly. It was thoroughly transformed into mere nutrients. Yi Chinzhou sighed inwardly, noting that while an 8th-level Qi refiner made for excellent fertilizer, the supply was unfortunately almost exhausted. He shouldered his wooden tools and brushed the mud from his hands, calling up the system interface within his mind. He looked over the rows of data, which were so exaggerated they would make high-level cultivators question reality itself. He allowed himself a satisfied smirk. Toward the front of the mountain, others were rushing off to some newly discovered secret realm to fight to the death. Yi Chinzhou looked up at the dazzling sword lights streaking across the sky. He curled his lip, feeling not even a hint of envy. Let them fight and scramble. Let them tear each other apart while he waited for the right moment. He imagined himself eventually heading to the edge of the battlefield with a sack, ready to extract attributes from the fallen. The cultivation world was far too dangerous. Yi Chinzhou decided he wasn't going anywhere. He would stay right here in this drafty shack, farming and sweeping, quietly amassing a fortune until he was invincible.